logic, that fragile flame we cling to, can be extinguished all too easily. When it is gone, when darkness claims the spaces where reason once resided, our laughter at the absurd becomes silence, and the unbelievable emerges, terrible and real. But before I slip too deeply into melodrama, let me tell you my story. I was just a child, barely 4 or 5, when it happened. It was before my siblings were born, back when it was only Mommy, Daddy, and me in our small, unassuming house in Great Bend, Kansas. A quaint home, modest in every way, its rooms held an air of something second-hand, furniture passed from one life to the next, carrying whispers of their previous owners. It was a hot, dull summer afternoon. I remember sitting on the thin carpet beside our enormous, flower-patterned couch, playing with my marbles. The marbles clicked and rolled as I swished them across the fibers, their movement nonsensical on such a surface. My mother was down the hall in the kitchen, my father away at work. One overzealous flick of my wrist sent my favorite marble, a ruby-red orb, spinning into the shadows beneath the couch. I stared at the dark void, hesitant. That couch was impossibly heavy. Dad was the only one who could move it, but he wasn't home. My marble was lost unless I retrieved it myself. Tentatively, I reached under the couch, my fingers searching the unseen terrain. The space was cool and dusty, my hand encountering nothing but emptiness. Frustrated, I withdrew it, only for something else to emerge. It was a hand. Thin and skeletal, its fingers long and bony, the skin blackened and cracked like burnt wood. It wasn't the deep brown of life, but the ashen black of death, a hue I couldn't comprehend at the time. The hand paused at the edge of the couch, motionless but deliberate, as if it waited for me. Then, slowly, it slid back beneath the couch and reappeared, this time pushing a crumpled plastic bag toward me. The bag had a logo on it, unfamiliar to my young eyes. The hand lingered, waiting for me to take it. When I didn't, it retreated into the darkness, taking the bag with it. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply stood, puzzled, and walked to the kitchen to tell my mother. She dismissed it as a child's imagination, laughing nervously while she walked me back to the living room. To prove her point, she knelt down and slid her hand under the couch, emerging victorious and empty-handed. But when Dad came home that night and finally moved the couch, all we found were my lost marbles and dust. For years, I clung to that memory, though my rational mind tried to erase it. I convinced myself it was a dream, a creation of childhood whimsy. That is, until I mentioned it to my mother as an adult. Her reaction froze the air in my lungs. She remembered it. She remembered me coming to her that day, my face pale, my voice steady as I described the hand. She admitted she'd been disturbed, not just by the story, but because I had always been a quiet, well-behaved child, incapable of such a lie. Then she told me something I'd never known, that couch had come from the estate of an elderly woman who had died on it. The couch was gone within a month of my story. But the terror didn't end there. I could never forget the logo on that bag. As an adult, I saw it again, a perfect match on a plastic bag in a hardware store. It was a bag of utility razors. I had always wanted a little sister, and my parents finally granted my wish. When they brought Sarah home, I was ecstatic. I wanted to share everything with her, my toys, my room, my world. But Sarah was different. She cried constantly, her wails piercing the night. My parents assured me it was normal, that she would calm down in time. Sometimes, her cries grew so loud that Daddy would take her to the basement to soothe her. The basement was soundproof, he said, so the neighbors wouldn't complain. Sarah didn't sleep in my room at first. She stayed in Mommy and Daddy's bed, their door always locked. Eventually, they moved her to the crib they'd set up in my room. I'd lie in bed, watching her tiny chest rise and fall as she stared blankly at the ceiling. One night, I tried to comfort her by passing toys through the bars of the crib. She'd throw them aside, her little fists clenched, her cries sharp and guttural. Daddy would come in, his face tight with frustration, and I'd quickly dive under my covers, pretending to be asleep. Then, one day, Sarah was gone. I came home from school to find Mommy sitting at the kitchen table, smoking a cigarette. She told me Sarah had gone somewhere we couldn't follow. Daddy dismantled her crib and threw away every drawing I had made of her. He ripped the labels from the toys I had set aside for her. We weren't allowed to speak of her again. It was as if she had never existed. But I saw her again. It was months later, during a trip to the post office. I was humming to myself, reading the posters on the walls, when I spotted her reflection in the glass of a display case. Her small, pale face stared back at me, her eyes hollow, her mouth twisted into a silent scream. When I turned around, she was gone. Some nights, I still hear her cries. Faint, distant, coming from somewhere beneath the floorboards. Sarah was as cute as I remembered, her picture pinned up on the wall among other missing children. But the name beneath her photo wasn't hers. Someone had written it as Shannon. My heart raced as I stared at her familiar face, trying to make sense of the mistake. Without thinking, I rushed over to Mommy, tugging on her sleeve. "Sarah's up on the wall," I said, pointing frantically. "They got her name wrong." Mommy's face turned pale, her hands trembling ever so slightly. She forced a tight smile and apologized to the lady at the counter, dragging me out of the post office before I could protest further. "But, Mommy," I shouted, trying to make her listen. "I saw Sarah. They have her picture on the wall in there." She kept trying to talk over me, her voice cracking with forced calmness. Finally, in a flurry of frustration, she slapped me across the cheek, the sting sharp and immediate. Tears welled up in my eyes. "That's not Sarah," she hissed. "It may look like her, but it's not. And if you don't stop, you'll be in big trouble when Daddy gets home." I cried quietly, promising to behave, but the damage was done. That night, I wasn't allowed dinner. I sat in my room, the silence pressing in on all sides. Through the thin walls, I could hear Mommy and Daddy arguing in the kitchen. Their voices grew louder, and then came the sound of kitchen drawers slamming. Heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs, stopping just outside my door. "Don't you dare," Mommy's voice shrieked, stopping Daddy in his tracks. He retreated downstairs, his steps echoing ominously. We never went back to that post office, and I never saw Sarah's picture again. This is the first time I've talked about Sarah since that day. I wasn't always rebellious. In fact, I was a straight-laced kid, good grades, polite manners, the works. But during my high school years, I started hanging out with Cody. He was a rich, arrogant jerk, but he threw legendary parties while his parents were away. Everyone went, despite his awful personality. One night, Cody's party was scheduled for 3 a.m. My parents would never have allowed it, so I decided to sneak out. At 1:30 a.m., my dad's snores rumbled from his room, and my mom was deep in her usual beauty sleep. I crept through the house, easing the sliding glass door open inch by inch. Once outside, the moonlit desert stretched before me, the cool air filled with an eerie stillness. The path to Cody's house was rugged and remote. I slid down a ditch to avoid any shady people on the main road. The ground was uneven, littered with empty beer bottles and cardboard boxes. As I walked, something strange caught my eye, a large, tattered tarp covering a massive lump. My curiosity got the better of me, and I approached it cautiously. The tarp's texture was rough and weathered, and when I touched it, the lump shifted. Before I could react, an enormous figure burst out with a low, guttural growl. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding as the creature emerged from the shadows. It stood at least 7 feet tall, covered in long, white fur that glistened under the moonlight. Its glossy black eyes locked onto mine, and it wore a dark trench coat and tattered pants, its presence impossibly human yet utterly monstrous. My voice caught in my throat as I managed to stammer, What are you?" The creature's lips curled into a grin, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. "Why, my boy," it said in a surprisingly jovial tone, "I am Mr. Trench." Despite my terror, his friendly demeanor stopped me from fleeing. He asked me about the date, his expression oddly earnest when I told him it was June 7th. My, he mused, stroking his furred chin. "I've been asleep quite a while." It was November the last time I awoke. We talked for a while about school, politics, and even celebrities. It felt surreal, as if I were trapped in a bizarre dream. But when I checked my watch, panic set in. I had only 15 minutes to reach Cody's house. "I have to go," I said, standing up. Mr. Trench's smile faded as he gestured toward a nearby flood drain. "Follow me," he said, his tone soft yet commanding. "I have something to show you." The drain loomed ahead, its dark entrance swallowing the moonlight. Mr. Trench disappeared into the shadows, his voice echoing back. "Come here." I hesitated, my instincts screaming to run. His voice grew sharper. "Come here, now." As he stepped closer, his features changed. Long, black claws extended from his hands, and his grin twisted into something predatory. "Come here," he repeated, each word dripping with menace. I bolted, scrambling up the slope and running faster than I ever had. Behind me, his voice rang out, a haunting mix of laughter and growls. When I dared to glance back, he stood at the edge of the drain, his glowing eyes watching me. By the time I reached home, I was breathless and trembling. My dad found me and thought I was having a panic attack. Maybe I was. I never told anyone about Mr. Trench, but to this day, I wonder, was he real, or had I encountered something from another realm? He rushed to my aid, his face pale and etched with concern. Between frantic breaths, I managed to explain that something had tried to attack me. Without hesitation, he called the police. When they arrived, I pointed them toward the exact spot, the pipe where Mr. Trench had tried to lure me. Armed officers moved swiftly, combing the area under the cold, watchful gaze of the moon. But there was no sign of him. The tattered coat he'd worn, the dirt-streaked ground where he had stood, all of it, gone. My parents held me at a distance, my mother's grip firm as though she feared I might run back. I pointed again, trembling, toward the pipe. The police chief motioned to his men, and they entered, flashlights cutting through the inky darkness inside. What they found chilled me to the bone. The pipe led to a concrete room no larger than a closet, damp with age and silence. There was no trace of Mr. Trenchfoot, but in the corner lay a pile of torn, bloodied clothes, far too small for an adult. My heart dropped as I realized they were child-sized, eerily close to the size of the clothes I'd been wearing that night. The air grew colder, heavier. The chief didn't say much, but the grim look on his face said it all. They sealed off the area and escorted us away. Life returned to a fragile normalcy after that. I was grounded for sneaking out, but my parents were too relieved that I was safe to let the punishment linger. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that clung to me like a shadow. The discovery in the pipe haunted my dreams, the bloodstains burned into my memory. Then, 3 weekends ago, I went camping in the Huntsville National Forest in Texas with some friends. It was supposed to be an escape, a chance to forget. We were all old friends from high school, now scattered across the state, but we made it a point to reunite once a year. This time, I chose the location. We drove out to the forest, parked our car at the campsite, and trekked deep into the wilderness. The first night was uneventful, filled with laughter and the usual ghost stories around the fire. But as the night wore on, a faint, sickly sweet odor began to drift through the air. It was subtle at first, like a rotting flower, but it grew stronger as the hours passed. Then Mike needed to pee. He wandered off into the trees, only to come sprinting back moments later, his face ghostly white. His jeans were soaked, not from the stream nearby, but from urine. At first, we laughed, cracking jokes about his aim, but the terror in his eyes silenced us. There's someone out there," he stammered, barely able to form the words. Before we could ask anything more, a distant sound pierced the night. A scream. High-pitched, raw, and desperate. It sounded human but wrong. Something about it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Clutching the only flashlight we had, Mike led us toward the source of the noise. The beam of light danced erratically across the dark forest, casting long, twisted shadows. The scream grew louder, more frantic, until we stumbled upon an old, decrepit cabin. A faint yellow light flickered from one of the grime-covered windows. The crying stopped the moment Mike knocked on the door. We waited, holding our breath as heavy footsteps thudded toward us from the other side. Then, with a deafening slam, something hit the door, rattling it in its frame. The lock clicked open. And then, silence. We circled the cabin, our nerves stretched taut. When we found a window high above the ground, Alex volunteered to take a look. We boosted him up, and he wiped away years of dirt and cobwebs to peer inside. The change in his face was instant. His eyes widened in sheer terror, and a scream ripped from his throat as he fell backward to the ground. He flailed, his limbs jerking uncontrollably as he screamed and screamed. We tried to calm him down, but he was hysterical, punching and kicking as if fighting some invisible force. We dragged him back to the campsite, the fire barely keeping the oppressive darkness at bay. Alex wouldn't stop screaming, his cries breaking into incoherent babbling before he passed out from exhaustion. By morning, he was catatonic, his eyes distant and hollow. When we returned to the cabin in daylight, it was gone. No decrepit structure. No light. Nothing. The faint smell of rot from the previous night was now overpowering, clinging to the trees and soil like a malevolent spirit. We left that day, but Alex was never the same. And sometimes, late at night, when the world falls silent, I hear it again, that faint, desperate scream. And I wonder, is Mr. Trenchfoot still watching? We stopped dead in our tracks, the cabin looming before us like a specter out of a nightmare. The air was heavy, suffocating, and the scent of decay clawed at our throats. None of us dared to speak, the oppressive silence only broken by Mike's defiant growl, "This is bullshit. I'm going in." Alex grabbed his arm, panic etched into his face, but Mike shrugged him off like swatting away a fly. "Do what you want," he spat, glaring at us. "Go home. I don't care anymore." The rest of us just stood there, frozen, as the sound began again, the maddening chorus of those Barbie dolls. Laughter, whispers, fragmented songs. The dissonance crawled under our skin like insects. We moved forward, though every step felt like dragging ourselves deeper into a grave. The stench of death wrapped around us, thick and suffocating. It was the same sickly odor from before, but now more potent, more vile. Then came the crying. Soft at first, like a child sobbing into their hands. It grew louder, overlapping with screams that seemed to pierce through our very bones. We kept moving. Finally, we crossed the creek and stumbled out of the woods, gasping for air as though we'd just surfaced from drowning. Relief was short-lived. The world outside the forest didn't feel safe anymore. We piled into the car, and Alex slammed the lock shut, his hands trembling on the wheel. The road to Houston was blocked, forcing us onto a detour. The dirt path snaked back into the trees, darker and more suffocating than ever. That's when we saw her. A girl, young and frail, staggered out of the shadows and into our headlights. Her face was pale, her eyes glassy, her lips cracked. Bruises peppered her skin, and her dress hung off her like a shroud. She stumbled toward the car, one hand outstretched, the other clutching her side. Alex froze, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. The girl reached for the passenger door. The handle rattled. "Don't!" Alex hissed, locking the doors with a sharp click. Her face pressed against the glass, her eyes meeting mine. Slowly, impossibly, her lips stretched into a grin that didn't belong on any human face. The corners of her mouth kept pulling, tearing upward until it was grotesque, a smile far too wide, filled with teeth that weren't quite right. We screamed. Alex hit the gas, and the car roared forward, throwing the girl into darkness. As we sped onto the highway, the air in the car was suffocating. No one spoke. No one dared to. Back at my apartment, we fell apart. Mike was the first to break, insisting it was all in our heads. But I could see the fear in his eyes, the way his hands shook when he tried to light a cigarette. The others disappeared one by one. Alex wouldn't answer my calls. When I knocked on his door, his mother claimed she didn't know who I was talking about. Mike vanished completely, erased from existence. Now I'm alone. the stench has followed me. That same rancid, suffocating rot. My mail slot clatters open at night, and pieces of broken dolls slide through. My father. He was the last person I tried to trust. When I visited him, he sat at the dinner table, staring at me with empty, black eyes. His mouth hung open, quivering as though he wanted to scream but couldn't. The police won't help. The last time I called, static overtook the line, followed by faint laughter and a whisper, "Come home." I haven't left my apartment in weeks. The shadows move now, growing longer, darker. Sometimes I hear the sound of rocks hitting my boarded windows. Other times, I hear footsteps pacing just beyond my door. And at night, as I sit in front of the screen, I can see it. In the reflection, behind me. A shadow, raising something high above its head, waiting. I can't look away. Tren pinched me, he hissed in a bitter, trembling voice. The mark on his arm was furious red, a bruise already blossoming into a grotesque purple swell. Instinct took over as I confronted the metallic being, anger surging through me like wildfire. I turned on it, my voice sharp and cutting. "You heard him!" I roared, pointing a shaking finger. For a brief moment, its cold, expressionless face flickered with something almost human, remorse, confusion, maybe even sorrow. Its lifeless eyes stared, unblinking, while its lips twitched, mimicking words it couldn't form. Was it apologizing? Or just mocking me? The ambiguity sent a chill down my spine. Later that evening, guilt gnawed at me. I sat beside it, my voice soft, coaxing forgiveness from something that wasn't even alive, at least not in the way we understood. I apologized, reassured it everything was okay. But deep down, I knew I had made a mistake. A few weeks passed. One night, my son crept into my room, his tiny frame silhouetted against the faint glow of the hallway. "Dad," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What is it, son?" I muttered, groggy. It keeps looking at me." I sat up abruptly. "What keeps looking at you?" "Anren." He was nearly in tears. "He just stands there, at the end of my bed. Watching." A knot twisted in my stomach. His small hands clutched his arm tightly, rubbing as though to soothe an unseen pain. "Come here," I said, urgency snapping me awake. When he pulled up his sleeve, the breath caught in my throat. A chain of bruises, ugly and raw, snaked up his arm. "Take off your shirt," I ordered, trying to steady my voice. As the fabric lifted, my heart sank. His small frame was riddled with marks, fading yellows, sickly greens, deep purples. My vision blurred with tears. Storming to his room, I threw the door open, expecting to confront the thing. "Anren!" I bellowed, the rage consuming me. But the room was empty. The bed was neatly made, toys scattered as usual. Then I noticed the window. The latch was unlocked, curtains swaying gently in the breeze. A loud thud echoed above us, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. My blood ran cold. "It's in the attic," I whispered to myself. The pull string to the attic hatch swayed ominously in the hallway. Slowly, I reached for it, every nerve screaming at me to stop. The hatch creaked open, and the ladder slid down, revealing darkness above. I climbed, flashlight trembling in my grip. The beam illuminated the small attic window, shattered. It was gone. From that night on, the signs of Anren's presence were everywhere. Scratches etched deep into the walls. Footprints in the garden, leading to windows. The red toy car that was once its favorite left conspicuously on the kitchen counter. It wasn't content to just watch anymore. Then came the night I lost everything. A blood-curdling scream tore through the silence, ripping me from my sleep. I bolted to my son's room, dread pounding in my chest. The sight that greeted me was chaos, his bed overturned, sheets shredded, the window gaping open. And my son, he was gone. I fell to my knees, sobbing, screaming into the void. The police wouldn't believe me. How could they? I lied, told them I hadn't seen anything. But I knew. Days turned into weeks. The house became a prison. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, felt like a taunt. It was still out there, watching. Waiting. And then, one morning, I found it, the red toy car, sitting innocently on the counter. But this time, I didn't touch it. I posted a simple question on a news group: has anyone heard of the Wanderer? I'd done this before, expecting the usual half-hearted responses, perhaps one or two people claiming they'd heard the story, but no one ever admitted to seeing the image. This time, though, something felt off. Not long after hitting send, my inbox pinged. An email from an unknown sender. The subject line sent a chill down my spine: "I can see you." The message body simply read, "Do you see me? I can see you too." An image was attached. My hands trembled as I hovered over the file. I couldn't be sure if it was the Wanderer image, but the email warned me, if you choose to view this image, you do so at your own risk. I couldn't resist. I must have been 6 or 7 when I lived in Lebanon, during a time when the country was torn apart by war. Bombings were so frequent they became white noise, but there was one thing I'll never forget: a children's show I used to watch. It was 30 minutes of unsettling, almost sinister imagery, a strange, unsettling blend of messages meant to scare children into behaving. Bad kids stay up late. Bad kids keep their hands under the covers when they sleep. Bad kids raid the fridge at night. The thing that stayed with me, though, was the final scene in every episode. A zoom in on an old, rusted door. As the camera crept closer, screams, agonizing and eerie, echoed from behind it. It was terrifying, especially for a children's show. A message would then appear on the screen, in Arabic: "That's where bad kids go." Years later, as a photographer, I decided to dig deeper. I needed to understand. After years of wandering, I discovered the studio where that show was made. It had been abandoned for years, but the curiosity gnawed at me. I went there, found the building charred, burnt from the inside, whether by fire or a desperate attempt to erase something, I couldn't tell. I explored for hours until I stumbled upon a small, isolated room. I broke down the door and froze in the doorway. The floor was scattered with traces of blood, feces, and tiny bone fragments. But the thing that made me turn and run was the microphone, a bolted cage hanging from the ceiling, eerily positioned in the middle of the room. I'm not here to exaggerate or make anyone paranoid, but I can't help but wonder if I was the first one to uncover this. I'm definitely the first to share it. I'll leave you with this: follow my trail if you dare. But beware, the road is narrow, the night is dark, and the walls are listening. I made my way up to North Wales once, deep into the mountains and valleys, far from any civilization. The address I had was almost impossible to find, but with a bit of local guidance, I finally reached the old research building. There it stood, hidden and decaying under a coat of fading black paint. I felt the heaviness of it, the sense that the building was almost alive, watching me. The road leading to it was narrow, so tight that the bushes scraped the sides of my car, and the gravel road turned sharply upward, refusing to let my vehicle reach the top. I had to park and walk the rest of the way. The front door wasn't locked, but the place gave off a palpable sense of dread. Windows boarded up. No signs of life. No vehicles parked inside. Just a place abandoned, forgotten. Or maybe, avoided. Inside, it was dark, just as I expected. My flashlight flickered over grimy walls, untouched by the usual markers of decay: no trash, no needles, no sign of other explorers. Just the uneasy silence. Then, I found it. The room. Like the email had described, an office space, untouched, unspoiled. The desk was immaculate. I approached, my stomach twisted in discomfort, as though the room itself was holding its breath. I set my cheap, outdated laptop on the desk and hesitated before opening it. But I had already been warned. The image, the one I shouldn't have seen, was still out there, lurking in the corners of this forsaken building. I wasn't about to gamble my own machine on some strange story I'd read online, no matter how interesting it seemed. When I powered up my laptop, I retrieved an old, Gray network cable, the kind that evokes the screech of dial-up modems and parents grumbling about hogging the phone line. One end slotted into the back of the machine. The other I fished behind the desk, crouching down to feel along the crumbling plaster until my fingers brushed against the port. But what I found there was strange. Someone else had already plugged in a cable. I unhooked it, replacing it with my own. When I stood, I saw that the cable I held in my hand was frayed, torn, as if it had been ripped away so violently that the plastic had split, the inner wires snapped. I still keep it around my office, a grim reminder of that moment. Nothing happened at first. No icons popped up. No message saying I was connected. The signal strength symbol in the corner of the screen insisted I wasn't online. I checked the printout of the email, scanning it for any mention of this. Nothing. Maybe the power was an issue, I thought. I called up the command window and tried to send a ping, a simple test message that checks the connection. To my surprise, I received 2 or 3 automated responses. I was online, all right. But then things got strange. The next step was to open the internet. I expected my homepage to load, but instead, I stared at a blank white screen for several long minutes before I was redirected to something different. It looked like Google at first, but it wasn't. The search bar remained center screen, but the address read www.patriots.com. The logo was no longer Google's familiar font, but a crude sketch of a soldier holding a flag, a British flag in one hand, an American in the other. The words Semper Fidelis were etched into the soldier's helmet. I tried to visit YouTube, but the page barely loaded before I was redirected again. This time, I was brought back to the same Patriot search site. My mouth went dry as I clicked on the search bar and typed in BBC News. The page loaded, and I began to skim through the headlines. What I read made my blood run cold. Second American Civil War grows in size and intensity. U.S. troops redeployed from Afghanistan, Egypt, and Turkey to defend home soil. France and Spain reeling after terrorists detonate thermonuclear devices at their borders. Police in Texas circulate CCTV images of suspects believed responsible for the kidnappings and murders of over 50 women since 2008. Handgun ban set to become law across America after last week's White House shooting spree. The US and UK to allow Australia and Canada to join the Patriot Alliance. UK terrorists continue to murder in border towns, demand Scottish independence. German physicists arrested by US agents for treason, research on alternate universes and interdimensional travel among confiscated items. I sat back, fumbling a cigarette to my lips, lighting it without truly feeling the burn. My mind raced. What had I stumbled across? What was this? It seemed too massive, too detailed to be a hoax. The email had warned me that this network, this alternate internet, was a bridge between our world and another. I went back to the Patriot search site. I typed in anything that came to mind: Olympics, Facebook, Human Rights Act, police powers, current world map. Slowly, I began to piece together a chilling image of a reality that wasn't mine. A blind man feeling his way through a cave. Every click seemed to bring more unease. The deeper I went, the more I realized how wrong everything had gone in this parallel world. Police forces in both the US and the UK were being phased out, replaced by the military. The only crimes investigated were treason and fraud. Meanwhile, killers and perverts roam free, some even gaining fan followings. I found a site dedicated to someone called the Dockyard Butcher. It included images and videos that twisted my stomach into knots. London, in this world, was a twisted reflection of itself. It was encircled by slum towns, the kind you'd expect in a third world country, not in the heart of the UK. And New York? Gone. There were records from the late 90s, but then, nothing. It was as if it never existed. I searched high and low, but it wasn't listed on any map. No one mentioned it in any forums. It was like the city had been erased from existence. Suddenly, a shrill bleep interrupted my thoughts. I had left the command drive open, testing my connection, and now I was receiving a ping. The first one, a simple response from the system. Then a second ping appeared, but from a different source. The IP was listed next to the notification. And that's when I realized something. That building, the one where this network originated, was the only one connected to it. These pings weren't from here. They were from there. The other world. They had felt my investigation and now, they were investigating me. I sat frozen, trying to understand what was happening. And then, the worst part, my laptop went crazy. The mouse pointer disappeared completely, unresponsive. The browser froze and then, as if guided by some unseen hand, redirected me to a blank white screen. A file began to load onto the machine. Its icon was a pale, lifeless eye, its pupil an empty void. The name of the file? Just a blank space. My heart hammered in my chest. It wasn't the laptop I was worried about now. It was what was trying to push through from the other side. Something from that world was making its way into ours. I yanked the cable from the wall, the static screeching violently from the speakers. The download bar froze at 75%, but I had already had enough. I threw the cigarette away, tore the laptop apart right then and there, and ground each piece into the floor under my heel. The machine was nothing but plastic shards and bent metal now. As for the old climate research building, I don't know what will happen to it. The council's been talking about demolishing it for years, but it hasn't happened yet. And when it does eventually crumble into rubble and ash, I won't mourn it. That socket, though, the one I plugged into, it's still there, waiting. A little window into the unknown. If you're curious enough to investigate, I can't stop you. But heed my warning, if they try to make contact, ignore them. If they try to come through, deny them. Trust me. You don't want to know what they want. The screen flickered to life, the cursor's jittery dance almost like it was anticipating something. Meek sat hunched, eyes wide with manic focus, his tongue swiping at dry lips, his long, grimy fingers hovering, trembling above the mouse. The computer screen reflected the glint of the dim room, old food, rotting clothes, and an overwhelming stench of stale sweat and urine thick in the air, sticking to his skin like an oppressive weight. The apartment was suffocating in its decay, disarray piled upon disarray. His long, yellowed toenail scratched lazily against the floorboards, sending a shiver of discomfort through his bloated body. Amidst the trash, the path around his apartment was barely navigable, narrow, congested, a maze of forgotten debris and sticky, foul remnants of a life long abandoned. It was as though the room itself rejected him, forcing him to shuffle through the layers of grime, the grime that used to be him. He was once something more, something human, but now, his existence was little more than the deranged clicking of a mouse in the dark, his only company the flickering screen that consumed his thoughts. He kicked at the pile of discarded pizza boxes, his foot sinking through the soft, greasy layers. The crunch of stale cardboard barely registered as his game character plummeted into the fiery depths of the screen, a pixelated disaster. His frustration boiled over. He kicked again, the tip of his toe cracking through the box, sending a sickening, metallic twinge of pain up his leg. The pain, though, was nothing compared to the torment that boiled inside him, rising with every failed click. He screamed at the screen, the words barely formed through his parched lips. God damn it all. Then came the disconnection. The internet blinked out, the screen going black for an agonizing moment. He snapped upright, pain lancing through his swollen body. His dirty, unshaven face twisted into a scowl as he limped, dragging his foot across the ground, half limping, half stumbling toward the kitchen. Sweat dripped down his forehead, mixing with the grime that coated his face. The stink of the apartment didn't seem to bother him anymore. In fact, he barely noticed it. He reached for the phone, a strange sense of urgency gripping him. His mother's trust fund had kept him alive, but the fact that he had to rely on it, that he relied on anything, was an unbearable thought. He didn't want to think about it. Not now, not with the disconnection, not with the pings echoing in his mind. Then, he froze. The phone was gone. It had been moved. Marie, he remembered. She took it, tossed it out, he couldn't remember. It didn't matter. His hands trembled as he sifted through the mess, his fingers brushing across cold, lifeless wrappers and soiled napkins. Roaches scattered, sensing his presence, their tiny legs clicking as they scurried away. His feet dragged as he stood up, a trail of blood staining the carpet beneath him. His foot was bleeding worse than he'd realized. He didn't even feel it at first, just the sensation of something cold and wet seeping into the ground. The sight of it, though, the swelling, the purple bruise, made his stomach lurch. He stumbled toward the bedroom, the familiar path obstructed by mountains of refuse. The trail of blood behind him marked his journey through the decay, a macabre signpost of his decline. The door to the bedroom was locked. Locked. His stomach churned as he pulled at the doorknob, the wood splintering under the weight of his desperation. The door broke open with a sickening crack, and he tumbled forward, his forearms slicing through the debris, feeling the sharp sting of splinters embedding into his skin. The room beyond was a forgotten hell, a place of memories fading into oblivion. The smell of decay, the presence of something other lingered. The walls, the clutter, the picture frames that had once been filled with memories of family and love, they were all distorted, shadows of a life he could barely recall. In that room, his past was a rotting carcass, left to rot beneath the weight of time and neglect. He had no intention of stopping now. The game was calling him, the invisible world beyond the screen lured him back with promises of control, of power, of escape. But in the back of his mind, something whispered, a warning, faint and distant. He could feel it, though, as the screen flickered again, as his character died once more. But this time, it wasn't just the game. This time, something else had been watching him. Something across the veil. The cold, calculating eyes of that world beyond stared back at him from the screen. And he knew, deep down, that it was too late to turn back now. He had crossed a line. And they were coming. The room was suffocatingly dark, the air stale and thick with something ancient, as though time itself had forgotten it. The faint light from the hallway seeped in, illuminating the dust motes that twisted and danced in the stale air, like specters caught in a macabre waltz at the door's violent intrusion. Had it really been that long? A year, maybe two, since he'd set foot in this forsaken place? The carpet, still a pristine beige, seemed almost out of place amidst the encroaching decay. It hadn't changed since they moved in, but then again, he hadn't truly seen it in years. The pictures Marie had insisted on, Parisian monstrosities in garish frames, still hung crookedly on the walls. Her idea, she claimed, was to make the room sunny, despite the lack of windows. She always had that need to brighten the impossible, the places meant to stay dark. The bed, disturbingly neat, was made, its dark brown comforter mocking the very color of the rancid filth he had just witnessed in the bathroom. But this was nothing compared to what was waiting for him now. On the nightstand, where once he and Marie had shared whispers in the dark, was the phone. It rested there innocently, as though it hadn't just been an object of destruction in his unraveling life. He limped over, a slow, painful shuffle as his bloodied foot left its crimson mark on the otherwise untouched carpet. Sitting down on the bed, the comforting coolness of the sheets seemed to mock his turmoil. He reached for the phone, his fingers trembling as they grasped the receiver, but then, in the corner, something was there, something he couldn't see fully. It was a shape, a form, lying still, hidden in the shadows of the unlit corner. His heart skipped, his body stiffened as an unsettling realization clawed at him. He dialed, but the silence that followed was ominous. The absence of a dial tone was the final nail in the coffin. The phone was dead, just like everything else here, and the bitter truth began to sink in. Marie had canceled the service, or worse, he hadn't bothered to pay the bill after she left. Frustrated, he threw the phone, his anger and confusion overwhelming him, sending the receiver clattering toward the square thing in the corner. Sweat trickled down his balding forehead, yet the cold of the room couldn't touch the heat that flared in his body. As he hobbled over to investigate, he winced with every step. His foot burned, a fire from within that mirrored the rising dread in his chest. Then he saw it. Not just a shape. A decayed, bloated corpse. An infant. Its skin was a purplish hue, twisted in grotesque spirals across its skull, the permanent scream etched onto its face. Its eyes were wide open, staring into some abyss of terror it would never escape from. Loneliness? Or something worse? Meek couldn't tell, but the thought of his own daughter. A sudden movement in the shadows behind the crib made his stomach churn. He turned, and there she was, Marie. But not Marie as he remembered her. Her face, eyeless and twisted in eternal agony, pointed upward, her mouth frozen in a cry that would never end. One hand rested on the edge of the playpen, the other pulled down the ragged remnants of her shirt, revealing where a breast had once been. She had fed the child before she herself had expired. Meek's mind refused to process the horror. In a haze of panic and desperation, he grabbed the phone again, still functional, and hobbled toward the door. The hallway outside, once so familiar, was now a labyrinth of despair. Boxes he had tossed aside moments ago now formed an impenetrable wall of refuse, blocking his way. His foot throbbed, the pain turning into something more, something suffocating as he tried to claw his way through. Then, he saw it, the screen. His computer. The place where he had once lost himself. Through the cracks in the cardboard and refuse, he could just make it out. The orange haze of the monitor, the symbol of his last remaining tether to the world. His mind swam. His body ached. He needed the internet. He needed it back. And then, a voice, quiet, too quiet, echoed from the shadows. "We need to have a chat about internet safety." Meek collapsed to the floor, his body barely able to support his weight as he stared at the glowing laptop screen, where a game of Minecraft flickered. His son, eyes wide and locked onto the game, was oblivious to the creeping terror that had just crawled into the room. His son had heard these stories before, stories of ghosts, monsters, things that should not be, but this one was different. It was about him. A slow, uneasy grin spread across Meek's face. The story he was about to tell was far too real. "Yes, son," the voice rasped, its tone too wrong, too distant. "Are you okay, Dad?" the boy whispered, voice quivering. "Machem," the father hummed, his voice thick and strangely hollow. Colby pulled the covers up to his chin, a defensive shield against the unnaturalness of the scene. "Is Mom around?" A twisted face appeared in the doorway, lower than the father's. It was his mother, but her voice had transformed into something inhuman, a pitch so high it scratched the air. "Were you about to tell us you gave our home address to Helper 23? Her words, sharp and cruel, sliced through the stillness. "You shouldn't have done that, Colby. We warned you never to share personal information on the internet." She continued, her voice hollow with menace. "He wasn't a child, not really. He only pretended to be. Do you know what he did? He came to our house, broke in, and murdered both of us. Just so he could spend time with you." A bloated man, dripping in rain-soaked fabric, lumbered into the room. His hands clutched two severed heads, their lifeless eyes staring into the void. Colby's breath hitched, a scream trapped in his chest, as the man dropped the heads with a sickening thud and pulled out a gleaming knife. "No." Colby gasped, his body frozen in terror as the man advanced, the knife shimmering with the promise of pain. Hours passed. Colby's screams grew weaker, his cries diminishing into pitiful whimpers. The killer paused, hearing the wail of a baby in another room. A slow grin spread across his face, hungry for something darker. Leaving Colby to die, the killer moved toward the nursery. The cries grew louder, guiding him like a beacon through the house. He reached the crib, lifting the baby with a cruel tenderness, his fingers stained with death. As he carried the child to the changing table, the crying ceased. The baby, instead of wailing, smiled at him. Helper 23 had never held a baby before, but he rocked it gently, wiping the blood from his hands to stroke its soft cheek. "Hey there, sweet little guy," he whispered. His sadistic rage melted into a sickly tenderness as he walked away, cradling the child. He would raise this child as his own, his twisted prize. When I finished the story, my son sat frozen, the terror clearly etched on his face. Between labored breaths, he stammered, "But Dad, my name's William." I gave him a classic dad wink, tousling his hair. "Of course it is, son." William ran upstairs, his steps frantic, though deep down I knew he secretly enjoyed the story. I knew there'd be no running water, but we were close to the bay, and I had crossed the river to get to the hospital. I started making my way back, feeling the weight of the disaster around me. I was lucky to be near the city limits. I doubted anyone downtown survived the collapse of those towering buildings. Almost every structure here was reduced to rubble, and the ones that weren't were still burning. At first, I didn't see a single soul, but then I came across something that twisted my stomach. A mother and child, huddled beneath the jagged shadow of a concrete awning. It was hell, pure, unrelenting hell. Her skin was peeling off in strips, revealing raw flesh beneath. Her eyes, those eyes, were an unnatural, sickly gold, almost as if they'd been scorched from the explosion. Her baby, though. God, her baby was blackened, like a rubber doll, charred beyond recognition, cradled loosely in her arms. The mother's gaze was vacant, her skin translucent in places, like the wings of a fly. The shock on her face was so grotesque it made bile rise in my throat. I called to her, but there was no response. She didn't hear me, no, she couldn't hear me. Deafened by the blast, her soul was already somewhere else. I closed my eyes, feeling a tremor of fear rack my body. I didn't want to be here, but I was paralyzed, trapped in this living nightmare, unable to look away from the horrors unfolding in front of me. As I moved closer to the riverside, the scene grew more nightmarish. People littered the streets, some standing, some collapsed in heaps like ragdolls, others barely clinging to life beneath the rubble. The burned bodies had begun to swell, their blackened flesh stretched tight, resembling grotesque rubber dolls. When I reached the river, my throat constricted, and I couldn't force the words out. Mom was silent now, and I could feel her dread pressing down on the room. It was suffocating. My heart was pounding, each beat more frantic than the last. The images my father had seen now etched themselves into my mind, like a grotesque film I couldn't escape. I saw hundreds of bodies, no, hundreds, piled against the banks of the river. They fought in their final moments, reaching out, desperate for one last drink of water. The current carried corpses downriver, floating like dead fish. One passed by, a woman, her intestines trailing behind her like a macabre scarf, whitened by the water. On the other side of the river, the mounds of human remains rose like grotesque hills. People stood around them, clawing through the mass of bodies, searching for their loved ones, tearing apart what was left of them. Children knelt, their cries rising above the chaos. "Daddy, are you there? Mommy, please, come out." I stood there, frozen, watching the sickening parade of agony, people digging through the mountains of human flesh, collapsing in exhaustion, others with organs spilling out, trying to stuff them back inside, desperately holding their bodies together. A man with his eyes burned out asked weakly, "Is anyone there? Please, kill me." Under the ashen sky, amidst the black rain falling like tar, I realized something that chilled me to my core. This was hell. Not a place of fire and brimstone, but this. I could never have imagined anything like this, not in my worst nightmares. Hell had come to earth. I stood there for what felt like hours, my back pressed against the cold, crumbling wall. The faces of the dead haunted me, their twisted expressions following me even in the darkness. The woman writhing in agony, the men begging for death, the grinning corpses floating by, they were burned into my vision, endless and unrelenting. I bolted to the bathroom, my shirt peeling off the wall as I ran. I barely made it to the toilet before I emptied the contents of my stomach, the bile rising up like poison. My head pounded, my eyes felt like they were going to burst under the pressure. The monsters I'd once feared in the dark, those I imagined hiding under my bed, or waiting behind the closet door, were nothing. Nothing compared to the real monsters I had just witnessed. The ones responsible for this destruction, there was no evil greater. I collapsed over the sink, unable to process what I had seen. I stayed there for what felt like forever, only snapped out of it when Mom knocked gently at the door, her voice soft and strained, reminding me I'd be late for school if I didn't hurry. 35 minutes later, I sat in class, my mind still numb. The teacher walked in, shushing the class with an unsettling calm. He wrote the date on the board, but his words hung in the air, heavy with something darker. "I know things have been difficult these last few days," he began, his voice low. "But we must all stay calm, okay? It's especially important to follow curfews and avoid causing any disturbances. I'm sure you all saw the incident last night. It seems someone had defaced the school sign. You may have noticed it this morning, yes?" I had seen it. The janitor was still out there, scrubbing at the sign. The word "sucks" was barely visible beneath the original name, Nagasaki Elementary. As the teacher continued, my mind drifted, but something else caught my eye. Outside the windows, a blue light exploded across the sky.